Welcome everybody. I am Mark McConaghy, Associate Professor in the Department of Chinese Literature here at National Sun Yat-Sen University, and today we are honored to have Professor Rebecca Karl from New York University's Department of History with us today to talk about her intellectual works and her contribution to China studies as a global field. Rebecca, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me. It's
Yeah.
a pleasure always coming to Taiwan and especially to Kaohsiung.
Wonderful. And so we're really looking forward to today's conversation. And I think as many of our viewers will probably know, Professor Karl has written many important monographs on modern Chinese history and the problems and the questions of China's socialist revolution, as well as China's current transition to less socialist times. And aside from her many important academic monographs, Professor Karl is also a deeply engaged scholar. She is a founding member of the Critical China Scholars Group, which is a group of intellectuals committed to responding to our new Cold War moment with perspectives and commentary grounded in socialist internationalism. She's also a member of the editorial collective Positions Politics, which is an online platform that fosters debate and collaboration on the question of Asia and its global significance. And of course, it's published in complement to the long-standing and very renowned journal Positions Asia Critique. And we are really honored to have you here today.
Thank you. Yes.
And so I wanted to start with a question, very basic questions. What led you to the serious critical study of modern Chinese history? Was it an interest in socialist revolution as a global phenomenon, and China being, of course, a particularly intense expression and experimentation with the problem of socialist revolution, or was it something else within Chinese history that originally piqued your interest?
I did not come to China studies via the classroom or via any professor. I came to it through Russian literature and Russian studies, and I was a visiting student in the then Soviet Union in the late 70s, early 80s. And when Soviet studies became impossible to continue to pursue because of geopolitical issues and so on, I decided that I was still interested in socialism and internationalism, in the formation of global solidarities that were not centered in the United States or that did not have to do with a U.S. imperialist version of the world. Remember, at the time we were just through the Vietnam War. My family had been part of the civil rights and the anti-war movement and so on, and so I had grown up relatively leftist, not communist, but and certainly not Marxist, but certainly quite leftist in the U.S. context. And China looked like an interesting proposition. I did not know at the time when I first went to China in the early 80s that China was in the midst of reinventing itself. And I had very little knowledge of China at the time, but it was revolution, internationalism, socialism, third world solidarities, that sort of thing that brought me to China to begin with, yes. Yeah. Interesting. Certainly not some deep fascination with traditional Chinese culture. Yeah. I had very little concept of that. And I really didn't speak Chinese when I first went, so I had to learn Chinese as well as the political situation at the same time. Yeah. And I think that turned out to be kind of interesting because it gave me a different vantage on things than most of my academic colleagues who came at it in a far more pedantic way. Yeah.
And the first time you went to the mainland, or the first initial moments of engagement. This was the moment, early 80s, mid 80s, where
early 80s, yeah.
Right, yeah, early 80s. So the socialist structure or architecture or infrastructure was still there, but of course we're beginning the process of quote unquote reform and opening. Did you sense that as a young student there, or how was it? What was was there an inkling of the changes to come?
Well, I wasn't really at the time a student embedded in the university system in China. I went and I was teaching English, and so the people I encountered were originally adult students who had missed their educational opportunities and who had been thrown into certain kinds of educational opportunities during the Cultural Revolution, and were being now retrained in a more rigidly pedagogical form. And they conveyed to me day in, day out in the classroom and in our leisure time and so on, they conveyed to me how much things were changing. And of course, at the time, nobody knew how much they were going to change. That was still part of a political and social struggle, as well as a cultural struggle. But it was a moment of real excitement where the future had not yet been foretold. There wasn't a future that had been already mapped out. I mean, the future was still wide open. And it was based upon still the ideals of a past of socialism, a past of a Marxist sense of things, but without the rigidities that had set in and that had influenced people's lives so many difficult ways. And so there was excitement about a new availability of consumer products. There was excitement about a new openness to the outside world, to the Western world, as it were, the Euro-American world. There was a lot of excitement about being able to move around the country without declaring fealty to revolutionary ideals. Right, I mean, right. to be a tourist in your own country. Right. And as the 80s went on, I spent a good deal of the 1980s in China before I went back to graduate school, and these were just years for me of exploring what China was, and how things were going to trying to think about both situating myself as a human being, as an American, but as a human being in this new world, and trying to think about what that meant about the world that I was living in too, I mean the US and so on. It wasn't immediately obvious what was portended, what was coming about, but it was clear that there was a lot of energy.
And at some point, you decide that you want to do a PhD at Duke University. And my next question is more geared towards understanding who were some of the scholars, either at Duke or elsewhere, who really had an intellectual impact on the way you thought about China and the world.
Yeah, I mean, I met during my perambulations around China in the 1980s, I found myself at some point in Nanjing in the late 80s, and this was right after the Tiananmen Square movement, and the June 4th movement, and the movement that ended on June 4th. And I had been in the United States very briefly during that time, and then I had come back to China to to go to the Johns Hopkins Center that had just opened at Nanjing, because I was trying to think about whether I wanted to go back to grad school or not. And so I had been away from school for almost a decade. and had decided I was going to leave Russian studies and Russian literature behind. You know, 1989 had just happened, and again, 1989 looked really, really interesting in the Soviet Union, in the then Soviet Union, and in Eastern Europe, but I decided not to go back to that, to stick now with what I had been doing for the decade previous, which was becoming acquainted with China. And I was in Nanjing, and I ran into, I was introduced by a friend to Arif Dirlik, who I sat next to at this famous dinner where I couldn't speak because I had laryngitis. But I croaked away, and he handed me his manuscript, which was then unpublished yet, on anarchism, and he said, you know, let's meet in 2 weeks and discuss this. Wow. And it was insanely intimidating and insanely strange to do that. And I really, quite frankly, have no idea what I said, but whatever it was, I must have said at this meeting, this subsequent meeting, led Arif to invite me to be his student and to go to Duke to study with him. But I went to Duke, and Arif really helped me fill out my political tendencies with theoretical heft, theoretical weight, with theoretical rigor, and with empirical historical rigor. And you know, originally I had thought I would do something on the 20s and 30s because that was at the time in the early 90s that had become a really German, you know, a really, you know, very, very hot, trendy period. And Arif actually suggested that I go back and look at the late Qing, because I had, at one of my teaching posts in the mid-'80s in Changsha, I had run into and become friends with this group of exiled Filipino revolutionaries who had fled the Marcos's Philippines to China, where they had been received by Mao Zedong and so on, and then had been resettled in Changsha. And of course, they were looking at the 1980s as this enormous retreat from the promise of socialism and an enormous retreat from the promise of Mao's China. But I had learned a lot from them, and I had become actually quite interested in how these third world solidarities, or had Asian solidarities, had started to form. And Arif suggested that I not start in the 20s and 30s with Sun Zhongshan and his notion of the, you know, the oppressed peoples of the world, right? Right? But to go back to an earlier moment and look at when the earlier moment of this kind of solidarity became possible, became thinkable, and became mobilizable as an ideological and process of thinking and theoretical analysis. And I was persuaded, and this was also helped through with my studies with Fred Jameson, who was also at Duke, famous Marxist scholar of Marxist philosophy, Marxist political and cultural philosophy, and so on, who also had become quite interested in China. He had just gone to China on this, you know, triumphal sort of tour, and he had brought back with him several Chinese students whom he was, you know, pleased to train and influence in whichever ways he could. And so there was this sort of improbable sort of conjuncture at Duke at the time of a Marxist political philosophy, a revolutionary, sort of taking revolution seriously for the 20th century China and the 20th century world. And also then these, cultural studies was just also getting off the ground and so on. And I had, sort of a dreamy experience of not only professors, Arif and Fred being two of the major ones at Duke, but also my classmates who became and have remained incredibly important to me in intellectual terms. People like Nefertiti Tadjar, who writes about the Filipino issues and social theory. John Beller, who writes about cinematic modes of production and media cultures. People like those who were my very, very close friends at Duke, and who Sarah Danius, who unfortunately has passed away, who was the head of the Nobel Prize, the Literature Nobel Prize Committee, Swedish woman who wrote about 19th and 20th century literary sensoriums and so on. These were people who really, really, really in our work together, our play together, we did a lot of cooking together because at the time Durham, North Carolina had nowhere to eat, and we all liked our, different kinds of food, and so we all made different kinds of food. At the time, Sadi Makdisi, who's a Palestinian activist and a professor of literature, of British Romantic literature at UCLA. These were my very closest friends and remain my closest colleagues and friends these days. I mean, these are the people I look to for political solidarity, for intellectual comfort and intellectual stimulation. So there were the China studies folks, Arif, Maury Meisner up at Madison, Wisconsin. Tani Barlow eventually entered the picture. Gail Hirschadter also eventually entered the picture, and so on. So there were a lot of those folks. Then there was Masao Miyoshi, and there were, Tak Fujitani, and all sorts of the Japan folks, Harry Haratunian, all of whom came into this extraordinary mix of intellectual ferment that was just so exciting. I mean, I have to say, my years at Duke were unexpectedly extraordinary. And that's where my I really chart my sort of intellectual formation to that time. I mean, I had obviously some latent aspects to this, that could become stimulated and manifest during that time. But it was a really important 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that. I remember as a student at NYU in 2004, 2005, we would get books, whether it was Staging the World or other things at Duke University Press or articles from various, and you tried to pass that intellectual ferment on. As of course, students and professors, some of our viewers may know, traditionally in America, the China studies powers are Harvard or Columbia, and it always seemed, wow, there's this other thing going on at Duke, this other thing, and where you have Frederick Jameson and Arif Derlich and all of these interesting kind of different ways of thinking about the 20th century, taking revolution seriously in a non-culturalist mode. Of course, Fairbank in Harvard and the impact, the China impact model. I mean, there are these older institutions and older ways of talking about China, and then as a student, we got this other thing, this Duke thing, right? And it just seemed exciting.
It was incomparably exciting, and it's only when I went back to Nanjing to do my dissertation research, and I went to Beijing to do my dissertation research, and eventually started to meet a cohort who had been trained in the Harvards and the Berkeleys and the UCLAs and the Chicagos and so on. And it turned out that we had really very little to say to each other, because it seemed that what we were studying was really quite different. And I don't mean to put down what they were doing. They were doing, deeply informed, deeply empirical research that has informed a lot of what we know about 20th century China, 19th and 20th century China today. I mean, those were the years when, 19th century legal studies, and so on was taking off, and there were some deeply important works being produced out of those places. But and I count my archive cohort as well, and library cohort as well, as very good friends and very important to me in an educational way of learning that wasn't what I wanted to do. Not because I have contempt for it, it's just that it's not what I wanted to do. I wanted to do something different. I wanted to do something that wasn't just about China in its own right. It was going to be about China. I think I have a thing that you printed out for me here that has a citation from me, so I'll cite myself, I'm sorry, that China has, for me is always and always has been a way to think about larger historical problematics. And so I wanted to think with China so that China became a way to think the world rather than a way to evade the world. And these were the years also of China-centered histories that became very important as an anti-Marxist and anti-communist sort of initiative and perspective. And so, you had to do internal Chinese histories to show that China was a world unto itself and always had been, and so on. I mean, these were the years, obviously, of, rediscovery of certain, themes and so on in Chinese history that then became have become quite prominent. That wasn't what I wanted to do. And my encounters with the graduate students who were trained in precisely those modes, I had read those histories and I had rejected them. And those graduate students really allowed me to humanize that, not just reject it out of hand in the way that one does as an arrogant graduate student. One reads and then you just, you reject it, and so on. And so it allowed me to think about those paradigms, those shaping frameworks, in ways that were less wooden than I had thought they were, but also that allowed me to still reject them. I still didn't want to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this brings us perfectly to your first book, Staging the World, Chinese Nationalism at the Turn of the 20th Century, published in 2002 on Duke University Press. And I think one thing we can say about that, the Duke culture and ethos and that excitement, is to take China and to think of it in a internationalist lens, in a materialist lens, not in a sinological lens. Whereas those previous histories and schools at Harvard or other places, whether it was the impact response model, whether it was the earlier Levinsonian culturalist model, can China be Chinese and modern, or the China-centered history, the kind of slightly updated version of this, all of these models and institutions are grounded in an investment in, as you said, China as a world rather than China in the world. And then 2002, Staging the World comes out. And it rejects and challenges this China-West dyad, this flattened binary of, China can only be responsive or can feel an impact of the West. But the question of that impact is not a question of how to build a new world, based on different principles, whether it's internationalism or anti-colonial solidarity, but how to conserve an older Chinese world, right? But your book comes in, and the book argues very famously, I would say, that there was, quote, a non-Euro-American consciousness of globality from the Chinese perspective in the late Qing. As Professor Karl just mentioned, Reef Derlich encourages you to go back to the late Qing, and what you find is that the work of journalists and playwrights and writers and intellectuals, they're deeply interested in spaces like Hawaii, in Turkey, in India, in the Philippines, Cuba, Vietnam, Poland, South Africa, and elsewhere. All of these spaces share an experience of Euro-American colonization, resistance to that colonization, and the kind of imaginings that resistance nourishes.
The other thing that happened during my graduate school training was that this was the Benedict Anderson moment of nationalism, right? Where nationalism was being imagined, reimagined, derivative, the Chatterjee moment of derivativeness and so on and so forth. And so my dissertation was originally really charting out, Chinese. It was about Chinese nationalism and the arrival of Chinese nationalism in the turn of the 20th century, and that was, a basically unexciting sort of project in its initial initial conceptualization. And then as I did more of that work, it became clear to me that I could look at nationalism from an internationalist perspective, that nationalism didn't have to be about China as a world, but China absolutely in the world. And as I did that research, there was this one essay by Liang Qichao, in fact, called 灭国新法论, which is about the new rules for destroying countries, in which it's a 1901 essay, and it's an essay that really goes through Poland, South Africa, Egypt, Cuba, and so on, and he shows how the world is now ordered and disordered, or organized and reorganized, to go back to something that we were talking about earlier, but how the world is organized and reorganized around the arrival of imperialist capitalism and settler colonialism over the globe, and then again, when I was writing the book, I was rejected for every single grant I ever asked for to get it done, other than internal. At the time, my first job out of grad school was at University of Florida, and I got a seed grant from them, and then I moved after 2 years to NYU, where I landed up very fortunately with Harry Haratunian as my senior colleague, and Harry had been a Reef's professor, and so it was a sort of school of thought. It was a nice, sort of way, and Harry really cleared the space for me to be able to write this book in the mode that I envisioned it being written, which was, by the time I got to writing the book out of the dissertation, I realized that I had to not only empirically show that this was doable, but also show what the theoretical stakes in this kind of rethinking were going to be. And so, it took me a lot of rewriting to get to the book, but by the time I got to the book, there were a number of tendencies already about Chinese nationalism, about the dyads of West China, about China rejoining the West, because of course these were the deep Deng Xiaoping years, and onwards, and so there was a certain sort of railroading of certain kinds of issues, and I knew, again, I didn't want to take that main path, that I wanted to do something else. And so I wrote the book in a spirit of deep defiance. And with the assistance of some very, very rigorous copy editing at Duke University Press, wrote in mostly, I think, understandable prose. I think, you know, I don't want to sound immodest, but I think the book still stands up.
Totally.
What I had hoped with the book was that we would push China studies not only to into a different horizon of thinking China in the world, but I would also help push China studies into a more theorized mode. The theorization, there's still only a very few of us who do theory in the China field in any serious way. And I don't mean applying, you know, Western theory to China, because I've always found that to be incredibly uninteresting, but to think of China as a theory producing place, not just an empirical producing place. And so from writing that book, then every other book and every other thing I've ever written has been a striving towards thinking about China as a place that can produce theory, not only as a, you know, not only in a sinological way, but as a way to think the modern world and, you know, that horrible word modernity, you know, in ways that are not imprisoned in a dialectic of West China or imprisoned in a Eurocentric paradigm.
Can you talk about fearlessness? Because the introduction of Stage in the World is fearless. Not only are you challenging the culturalist, sinological, China West, either China can only be concerned about protecting some kind of nativist essence, or it must replicate some kind of self-strengthening to become a global superpower and replicate the logics of power. But your book said, no, they could think the world in a different way, in a way that was about solidarity, not routed through either nativist Chinese experience or Western Darwinian ideology. And so you were challenging the field, and you also directly challenged the way we think about the relation between nationalism and statism. Very famous passage. We don't necessarily have to go to the details, but as a young assistant professor in the field, without tenure, I mean, that to take those powerful stands, I've always thought of the word fearless. And I think that's something that graduate students and young scholars struggle with.
Well, I mean, I had been cautioned that it was unwise to do that. And of course, it did not win me friends in the field. But I had a very, and, you know, so I can't say I recommend it to everybody. You know, it's my personal sort of style is to just, you know, go ahead like a bull in the china shop, as it were, and to not. Part of it was because I was also an older student. I'd been out of school for 10 years, and so I was already in my mid-30s by the time this, you know, was getting done. And, you know, heading into, you know, 40 years old. And so I wasn't afraid really of a lot, although I also have to say that I felt very protected because Harry was my senior colleague, and I knew that, you know, whatever academic calumny was going to follow, or whatever academic wages had to be paid for being fearless, I did have a pretty good support system in my particular situation, in my particular university. I don't know that I'm capable of doing it any other way, quite frankly. I don't know that I find it interesting to write things that aren't fearless. I think I really did learn that from Arif, who also was not a favorite of the field, you know, who also rubbed many people in the field the wrong way, intellectually and politically. And, you know, the politics of the time, of the 1990s and the early 2000s, was a fiercely anti-revolutionary politics, and it was fiercely repudiating the politics of revolution, the politics of socialism, the politics of the capacity to think the world otherwise. And so I felt like I had to write in a way that made clear, and this will lead us into the Mao book, but I had to make clear why and how people did feel empowered to think the world differently, and could be fearless in their own practices, in their own intellectual explorations and so on, to defy settled knowledges, settled paradigms, because this does require a certain fearlessness. And while we think of, let's say, Liang Qichao or Kang Youwei these days as relatively conservative, or at best, sort of mildly liberal, they were real rebels in their time, and it took a lot for them to move away from the worldviews and the textual studies and so on that inform their world. And I think it's not to heroize them or turn them into great man theories of history, which I don't believe in, but I think it's important to think about why and how different worlds become visible and different worlds become imaginable. Yeah. And that's what I went into my Mao book with the idea of trying to explain not why Mao Zedong became an authoritarian tyrant, but why he thought he could change the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And the prices that sometimes we have to pay for that. And this brings us to the Mao book. So Mao Zedong in China in the 20th century, also on Duke University Press, 2010. So this is about 6, 7, 8 years later. You're now teaching at NYU, and you open a course called Mao and the Chinese Revolution. And of course, this is the moment where
you enter the picture.
I become a very, very, very peripheral, small part of your intellectual journey, but you become a big part of mine in the sense of. It's of course a truism, life-changing classes, but I think there are those life-changing classes. And 2005, 2006, this was a moment where, especially regarding questions of revolution and Mao in particular, there were many, there were a number of notorious books that, Mao was a tyrant, Mao was Hitler, Stalin, and this moment of a deep antagonism to revolution. And of course, China moves into the WTO, is welcomed into the global capitalist world. It seems to be a success story, GDP growth of every year of 10%, people talking about how material life is improving, and the courage, the fearlessness to go back to the Maoist era at a time of high capitalist triumphalism and the success of China's reintegration with the capitalist world, seeming to confirm all of the ideologies of pro-capitalist scholars throughout the world. You come out with this book. And I just want to quote from the preface of this book, because it's such an important and I think beautiful paragraph, and then I'll just let you kind of think and talk about how this book came about. Quote, "One motivation for writing this book was personal. It is dedicated to my nephew, Christopher, and my nieces, Tepi, Channa, Sophia, and Nora, who face so many challenges, in part as legacies of the historical moment discussed here. The world they and their generation will inherit is much poorer for what has been called the project of dystopia, which is not the temporary absence of utopia, but the political celebration of the end of social dreams." And that last sentence is a quote from Zizek. This book introduces a historical moment when fundamental global transformation could be thought. It is a moment I admire, yet I harbor no illusion that the specific projects toward which Mao Zedong worked are appropriate or even sufficient for today or for his world. I'm optimistic, though, something of his philosophy, passion, and historical method can be retrieved for a rethinking of our present. And so, how did this book come about?
Well, let me just say that in relation to that very last sentence, that I'm optimistic. I was teaching the Mao and the Chinese Revolution class this past semester during the rise of the encampments and so on at NYU and in the United States over the genocide in Gaza, and some of my students wrote big calligraphy, big character posters, 造反有理, to rebel is justified. And so they had these, these big banners, 革命有无罪, there is no, it's justified to rebel, and the revolution is not a crime. And they wrote these banners and placed them at the encampments, and they became a real, at Columbia and at NYU and other places. I'm not certain that all of the students who used these phrases actually knew where they came from, although I know my students did because I taught them. But so that actually was, a moment of optimism. I suppose that students, not because Mao's revolution or because, it needs to be replicated or anything, but because the idea of protesting against a world that is fundamentally corrupt and flawed, that is fundamentally stacked against you, that is fundamentally filled with injustice and all of the forms of injustices, whether it's imperialist, whether it's political economic, whether it's racist, gendered, whatever, that they were, and of course in this very moment, the moment of the genocidal assault on the Palestinian people and the erasure of their capacity to think of futurity, because of the erasure of their past, of schools, of archives, of libraries, and so on, something that's been called scholasticide. Anyway, not to be carried away by that, but to think about the ways in which there was a time in the world when you can think of futurity that was not just a repetition of the past or a repetition of the self-same of a mainstream. And that's really what drew me to Mao and to opening this class to begin with, which I was casting about for another project after I finished Staging the World, and I had been writing, excuse me, I had been writing a project on like the missing gender chapters in the Staging the World, because there was no, I had a gender chapter, and then I decided to take, I was not going to be that. Which I'm going to ask about. Right, I was not going to be that person to have the gender chapter, right? And so I decided to take the gender chapter out and to write a separate account of feminism and nationalism that would be my second book. And I wrote a couple essays based on that. I did an anthology with Peter Zero about 1898, and in which I sort of debuted some of the gender analysis that I was going to promote or write about and so on. And it became very, it was really hard for me to get motivated to do that. Not because I was uninterested in feminism and gender, but because I hadn't really thought those, it didn't feel like the right fit for the time. I didn't want to go back to the late Qing. I didn't want to retread over that same period. I really did want to push into something else. And so I opened the class on Mao and became really enthused by the student enthusiasm and became really interested in trying to think about how to reconnect Mao, not in a strictly biographical form, but the trajectory of his life and thought and activism and revolutionary movement to a world that still thought it was possible to change things fundamentally. And this was, of course, done in a moment of even deeper anti-revolutionary ideological movement. This was done in a moment when Mao, of course, had been thrown onto the dustbin of history. Quite literally, his statues were coming down all over China. They were being thrown into the garbage. And a new dawn was coming in China that was all about joining tracks with the world and being entirely swept up in a different form of transformation altogether.
But one of the interesting questions, of course, which you would raise in the 2013 monograph, The Birth of Chinese Feminism, Essential Texts in Transnational Theory, which was a edited volume, co-edited between yourself and Professor Lydia Liu from Columbia and Professor Dorothy Ko from Columbia, where you translated the late Qing anarchist feminist writer He Yingzhen's writings, essentially unknown to the English-speaking world before this translation. Very little known, of course, I think in Chinese scholarly circles as well. So this was a really important work of translation, as well as historical contextualization and analysis of bringing this late Qing feminist voice, anarchist voice to global prominence. And one of the questions that you grapple in the introduction to those translations is, for example, as discussed and theorized by Liang Qichao, the liberation of women in China would be in service of the nation, would be in service of a larger national or statist project. Whereas He Yingzhen, as you put it, for He Yingzhen, by contrast, the feminist struggle was not to be subordinated to struggles that advanced the nationalist, ethnocentric, or capitalist modernization's agendas. Rather, it was the beginning and outcome of a total social revolution that would abolish the state and private property to bring about true social equality and the end of all social hierarchies. So it was thinking the problem of gender not to replicate pre-existing or new hierarchies around state or around ethnicity, but to think a radical restructuring of social relations themselves through the problem of this relationship between nannu, or the relationship between nannu and shengji, material questions, questions of life, questions of reproduction.
I just want to say that translation has been one of the things I've done in the interstices of all of my monographical and other writing. I mean, I've always considered that if China is going to be a source of theoretical consideration, if Chinese thinkers or people who think from the Chinese context are going to be part of a global academic or global philosophical stream, people have to have access to their writings. And so I've always done a lot of translation. I mean, I've translated a lot of Wang Hui, I translated Cai Xiang, I've done a lot of translation over the years, and this is, sort of the gaps between my own published books have always been taken up with translation. That said, the He Yingzhen book was not a gap filler. He Yingzhen, you asked me, when did I discover her? I think she discovered me. It was sort of it came out of a workshop that Lydia Liu was organizing at Columbia that she called a living texts workshop. And she wanted to think about texts that could live in our time, and lived at one time, but had been forgotten in the meantime. And so this living text workshop was intended to try to excavate texts of of a different time to think about our current moment, and not in some sort of linear, Chinese thinking has always been Chinese, or anything like that, but to think about ways in which we could think about texts differently, as not as dead artifacts, but as living discourses about the world. Anyway, so out of that came an interest in, as she was then known, He Zhen. And we coalesced around her, and Dorothy, who's a professor at Barnard, under at Barnard College at Columbia University, is a pre-modernist, and she was very loath to participate because she said, I don't do modern, that's not my field. But we roped her into it because Lydia and I, separately and together, can be slightly persuasive. And we divided up the work. And He Zhen wrote in a style characteristic of the time, which was neither classical nor modern. It was unpunctuated. It was filled with 错别字, with typographical errors. We didn't even have access to her to many of her to some of the writing, and she had also been the victim of misattribution, where some of her writings had been attributed to her husband, to Liu Shipei, rather than to her. So we had a huge sort of problem ahead of us in clarifying what she had and hadn't written, trying to figure out what the standard forms of her essays were, and so on. So that was a huge sort of really sinological, really deeply sinological sort of thing. And then once we had, we had made our selection of which of the representative essays we wanted to translate, we divvied up the work, and we then set about each translating our own things, and then meeting relatively frequently to go over translational issues, to think about terminologies, to think about how to standardize our translations, and to set up a collaborative process so that each of our translations went through several other readings, and so on. And so we, and in those discussions and in that process, we really came to understand that He Zhen, and we added her maternal surname to be, so that she's no longer He Zhen, she's He Zhen, because she had, in one of her essays, she had proclaimed that she was against patriarchal family names, and that she wanted to hitherto be known as He Zhen, as carrying her maternal surname as well. So we hyphenated her name in a good, liberal Western fashion, and turned her into He Zhen. We then went to Fudan University to present what our findings at the then there had by then there were semi-annual, once every 2 years there was a gender studies conference under the aegis of the Fudan History Department, and organized by Wang Zheng and a bunch of other folks. And so we went and we introduced her there. And so we reintroduced her into China via the English translations that we were doing. And it became really, it became a real sensation at some level. I mean, because we were reintroducing this major theorist. We chose this title for the book, The Birth of Chinese Feminism, Essential Text and Transnational Theory, to try to insert her into the, the circuits of theoretical discussion of feminism from around the world, so that China is no longer sequestered, it's no longer, sort of isolated, that she becomes one of these people with whom we can think the contemporary world and her world, because she was, as you cited, she was one of these very, very rare folks who did not subordinate feminism or women to a national project, but was very much intent on thinking about what the liberation of humanity looked like, which was not going to take national form as far as she was concerned, was not going to take the form of capitalism, was not going to take the form of China emulating the West, was not going to take the form of electoral politics or procedural processes or anything like that. It was going to be the liberation of humankind from poverty and want, which, as a good anarchist, she was very clear those were the bases of servitude and of oppression. So, she's an always astonishing writer and theorist. Reading He Ying-jen and her real sense, she was deeply steeped in the Chinese textual tradition. And if you really read her essay that we gave to Dorothy to translate, called "On the Revenge of Women," right? News of Fu Chou Lun, right? On the Revenge of Women. It's really, she rereads the foundational texts of the Chinese textual tradition to show, sort of like Simone de Beauvoir does in Second Sex, but to show how these and long before, of course, Simone de Beauvoir does this for the Christian tradition of European thinking, but she shows how these texts repeat and reiterate the subordination of women over and over and over again, even when this is not their main topic. And so she's deeply engaged in this textual reading that is simply extraordinary for its breadth and scope, and for its anger and rage over how this supposed, harmonious tradition is all about the subordination of women's bodies, women's minds, women's capacities, women's lives to a patriarchal norm that also subordinates most men, whose only response then is to subordinate the women in their spheres, because that's the only place they have domination. And so, you read this, it's incantatory. It's like a chant, almost. And these were, of course, the challenge of translating that particular piece was that those were texts that were very much still alive in He Ying-jen's time, that are absolutely quite dead in ours.
And that's an important methodology, because to make the tradition speak differently, or to reveal how it actually functions in contradistinction to the way it speaks about harmony and cultivation, etc., but to fearlessly read against the grain of the tradition is a crucial intervention. And of course, the work of translation, of excavating different voices, different methodologies from modern Chinese history is a work that would continue in 2017 with the publication of The Magic of Concepts, History and the Economic in 20th Century China. And this is a work centered around the Chinese economist Wang Yan'an. And I know that Wang was a figure that you read and lived with for a long time.
And it was on I was in Beijing doing research originally on the revival in the early 20th century, in the early 2000s, of a debate about semi-colonialism and semi-feudalism. So the Banfangjian, Banzhimindi, the two semis, as I call it, right? The Liang Ban, right? So so it had become a real issue in historical research in the late 90s, early 2000s. And there had been a huge number of debates in Lixun Yanzhou, in the historical research and other kinds of journals and so on, about whether semi-feudalism, semi-colonialism were in fact stages of history, whether they were useful to think about with or think through. They had become, of course, talismanic, incantations for much of the Mao era history, and all of that was being jettisoned now. And so, did people actually have to think about the two bands, the two semis, or could you just get rid of it all? Anyway, in the context of doing research at the social sciences, the Institute of Social Sciences, the Modern History Institute, I looked up the keywords, and at the time there was still a card catalog. So I looked up in the card catalog, the Banfangjian or the Banzhimindi, the semi-semi, and a book that had been written in the 1940s by this guy, Wang Yanan, came popping up, and so I asked the librarian to bring it to me. And I then became acquainted with Wang Yanan through that, and I started to follow him through some other things. And so it was through that particular issue. And then he also was a theorist of, a very critical theorist of the Asiatic mode of production, which started to preoccupy me because it was, again, one of the issues that came up in the late 90s, early 2000s. And so I started to realize that certain questions, whether it was the semi-semis, whether it was the Asiatic mode of production, whether it was China and political economy, whether it was the stage theory of history, whether it was, various kinds of questions that had reemerged in the 90s and 2000s had already emerged for the first time in the 1930s.
Right.
And so this was history then as not as repetition, but repetition with a very big difference, because in the 1930s, all of these issues had emerged as critiques of capitalism. Right. And now they were emerging as part of the move away into capitalism, away from socialism. And so it turned out that Wang Yanan was really central to the 30s and 40s conceptualizations of these issues. And then again also to the conceptualization in the 1950s of a transition to socialism, which I'm dealing with now, which is why I'm still talking about Wang Yanan. But so, he came to my attention at that point, and then I started to read him, and it became clear that nobody had really written about him at all. And yet he was like the original, with Guo Dali, he was the original translator of Capital Volumes 1, 2, and 3 of Marx. He was a major translator of Marxist texts and of Japanese Marxist texts into Chinese. He had spent time in Europe. He had spent time in Japan. He turned out to be this major figure that nobody had ever talked about before. And so I then became really fascinated with him because he was an important Marxist without having been in the earlier period until the late 50s in the anti-rightist campaign. He had been a Marxist without ever being a communist. Right. He was not a party member until he had to join because he was going to be denounced in the rightist campaigns. But before that, he was somebody who had not subordinated theory to revolutionary necessity. And I found that really liberating for the kinds of ways in which I could think about him, and I discovered that he thought about the world.
Yeah.
So,
no, and I think that book needs to be really grappled with in more detail.
Now, again, the China field will not deal with that book, and it's been mostly, you know, because my critique in the first chapter of, you know, the big figures in the field, whether it's Philip Huang or whether it's Ken Pomerantz or whatever, who's rewriting of Chinese history in an economic developmentalist idiom. I call, you know, a critique. I call my critical chapter about that a critique of pure ideology, because where economism becomes the ideological norm, you know, and Wang Yanan was really, really critical of that, and so. The book, Magic of Concepts, and this is his term. He talks. You know, when I came across in an essay of his, I came across this turn of phrase, 概念的魔术. I thought, okay, well, there's a book title for you, you know. And so at first, you know, friends of mine said, oh, well, you could call it conceptual conjury. And that doesn't make for a good title. I said Magic of Concepts makes for a very mellifluous title. And so, you know, I've always struggled with titles, so I seized onto that and was able to think it through those terms of how concepts do magical work by being flattened into ahistorical descriptors. Rather than theorized modes of thinking, and where the economic then becomes a naturalized set of procedures, social procedures, rather than a very historically rooted way of thinking the world. And so I followed Wang Yanan. He served my purpose then in Magic of Concepts to think through several of the conceptual terms that had been problematized in the 1930s and had become naturalized in the 2000s or 1990s. And so he became a very important figure for me in that pursuit. I think I'm still fascinated with him in a lot of ways. Again, this has given rise to certain other folks now have started to work on Wang Yanan in a critical mode that I find.
I wanted to ask you about our current moment. And of course, in 2020, you just recently published your most recent book, which is China's Revolutions in the Modern World, A Brief Interpretive History. And this book is published on Verso. So if I'm not mistaken, it's the first monograph that you've published on Verso. And it's really an attempt at explaining in a materialist, critical idiom how we think about China's revolutions in historical terms. But of course, this book is written in a particular moment, and it seems to me like the particular moment we're in, of course, one might call it neo-fascist, nativist, a moment of deep retreat into culturalism, into nationalisms, into the inside, into fantasies of purity, of bordering, of revival, romanticist notions of national cultural revival, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, how do we resist, in a fearless idiom, in He Yinzhen's idiom, in Wang Yanan's idiom, how do we resist these frameworks that just send us back into the nation, that send us back into the culturalist inside?
Yeah, well, to go back for a moment to Wang Yanan, to Magic of Concepts, I mean, one of the things that I wanted to think about there was how in the 1930s there wasn't a naturalized understanding of the relationship of concepts to everyday life. Whereas by the 1990s, 2000s, somehow concepts in life had become naturalized. And so that it's really trying to think about what work do concepts do? And how can we reanimate conceptual work to be the question rather than the answer. And so the Revolutions book was and still is really a serious attempt to seize back the revolution as a 20th century, as a paradigm of 20th century life and the 20th century world, in the face of the erasure of the Soviet Revolution, of the Chinese Revolution, of revolutionary movements altogether. How, again, and this goes all the way back to Staging the World, where I'm thinking about, the ways in which Chinese thought, revolution as a paradigm of anti-imperialist, anti-colonial resistance, but then to think about why and how does revolution, rather than rise and rise and revitalization of the Chinese nation, which is now the paradigm that is most common in China and that has become a real talisman of China's global rise, is to think about why and how revolution was and has to remain the story of the late 19th into the 20th century. And so it's, an explicit and an implicit sort of argument, again, that culture is never the answer. Culture is always the question. Culture, it's a struggle. Culture is the struggle. It's not the answer to anything. And, to understand the state, the Chinese state is not some enduring harmonious whole that has, of course there's been a Chinese polity for, centuries and millennia and so on. That's the question is not that, to say that there was no China. There was no China as we know it, but the question is to think about how the state, how culture, how either civilization or culture or whatever is the stuff of historical struggle. That is what history is. History is not just the reinstantiation of known codes and protocols that just get mindlessly repeated from era to era. I mean, this is the stuff of struggle. And to erase the struggle, to erase the conflict, to erase what happens under the surface of these dominant protocols, these mainstream protocols and coding of everyday life, to think about what that is. I mean, I don't do all of that in the book because the book was written for a more accessible audience, and so it was published with Verso. And I wrote it really in 5 months' time. I just, it just came out. And so it's not like hugely complex or hugely complicated, but it's written in this moment of again, defiance and insistence that we recall that history is the stuff of struggle, not the stuff of, harmonious domination and obedience. And to think that, and to recover those issues. I also want to caution that my answer in these books is never that the revolutions of the 20th century are adequate to our day. I mean, today. It seems to me that we've been through the seizure of state power by revolutionary parties, and we've come out the other side with huge historical failures, where the radical project of the revolutions radical projects have been hijacked or waylaid or restructured in ways to, of course, take care of there are real reasons why all of this happens. I mean, it's not like there's just some abstract thing that happens out there. It's and it's not that all revolutionaries must necessarily become tyrants. It's just that they're in dealing with real world problems. stable states are anathema to revolutionary, movements. And so I think we are in a moment now where revolution of the old type, where the emphasis is on the seizure of state power, can no longer be the agenda item that we have to aim for. I mean, we have the seizure of the state. I mean, states are powerful, states are important, but I think we now have to seize capitalism.
Right.
And I think capitalism as neoliberal, the moment and our current moment have demonstrated, states are now beholden to capital in a way that, rather than capital being beholden to states. And I think that our target has to be above the state, more diffused than the state, more capillary, more both materialist and so on. I have no answer for how to do that or what that is even called. But I think that some of the movements, whether of the 2000s, Occupy, the encampments today, the sort of student movements that are trying to invent new ways of being in the world, new ways of understanding the world, new ways of thinking the world, these are going to become key to how we think. What our new tasks are and so on. And I'm very, very ready to take a back seat to that and let the students lead, because I think they're really endlessly inventive, endlessly interesting, and endlessly critical of the world that they've inherited. And I think it's, I think it's possible to now at least coming out of, the hotbed that has been this, this moment in New York and in the United States in general, this moment of really viral, to use a, media term, a really viral, spread of not pandemic contagion, but of political contagion. I think it's been, really clarifying and really important. Where it leads is not clear yet, and how to build a more durable, non-vanguardist, non-dominating movement out of it is yet to be determined. But again, we're at a moment of business people like to call it inflection points. I like to call it a conjuncture. We're in a real conjunctural moment again. We're in a moment of where our futures again are not completely foretold. Where we could go in the direction of fascist genocides and racist nationalist exterminations, or we could try to think something new. And I'm not certain that revolution is, or at least revolution in the old sense, is where we need to be for that. But it's absolutely certain that we have to think in transformative terms.
Yes. Thank you very much for watching, everybody.
Thank
you very much.
Thank you, Mark.
Yes.
Thank you to our crew, who have been very patient and very wonderful.